In the public imagination, major criminal cases end in one of two ways. A suspect is caught, or the truth is revealed. But there is a third ending, one that receives far less attention. Sometimes, an investigation doesn't end at all. It simply stops. No press conference, no apology, no resolution. Just a quiet administrative decision made behind closed doors. In 2016, the Federal Bureau of Investigation did exactly that. After more than 4 decades of active pursuit, the FBI officially closed one of the most famous unsolved cases in American history. There was no arrest, no confirmation of death, and no definitive explanation of what truly happened. Only a short public statement announcing that the Bureau was redirecting its resources elsewhere. For most Americans, this moment passed unnoticed. But for investigators, aviation experts, and criminal historians, it marked something extraordinary. A rare admission that the most powerful investigative agency in the United States had reached the end of the road. This is the story of that case. A case that began in the open skies of the Pacific Northwest, a case that embarrassed federal law enforcement, a case that forced permanent changes to airline security. And ultimately, a case the FBI quietly walked away from. To understand how this crime was possible, you have to understand the America it happened in. The year was 1971. Commercial air travel was relaxed, informal, and built on trust. Passengers walked directly to boarding gates. There were no metal detectors, no baggage scanners, no identification checks. You could arrive at an airport with cash in your pocket, buy a ticket under any name you chose, and board a plane without anyone asking who you really were. This wasn't negligence. It was normal. Airlines prioritized convenience over caution, and hijackings, while not unheard of, were treated as rare disruptions rather than national security threats. On the afternoon of November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, this environment set the stage for a crime that would exploit every weakness in the system. At Portland International Airport, a man approached the ticket counter. He was calmed out, well-dressed, unremarkable. He purchased a one-way ticket for Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, scheduled to fly from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington. He paid in cash. When asked for his name, he provided one, Dan Cooper. There was nothing unusual about him. No nervous behavior, no visible weapon, no reason to attract attention. To the airline staff, he was just another holiday traveler. But within hours, he would become one of the most elusive figures in American criminal history. Flight 305 departed Portland at 2:50 p.m. On board were 36 passengers and 6 crew members. The flight was scheduled to last less than an hour. The man calling himself Dan Cooper took a seat near the rear of the aircraft. He ordered a bourbon and soda. Witnesses later described him as polite, quiet, and composed. There was no sign of agitation. Then, roughly 20 minutes after takeoff, Cooper leaned toward a flight attendant and handed her a small note. At first, she barely glanced at it. In the early 1970s, flight attendants frequently received notes from male passengers, often phone numbers or flirtatious messages. She assumed this was no different. She placed the note in her pocket without reading it. That's when Cooper spoke. His voice was calm, controlled, almost courteous. "Miss," he said, "you'd better read that. I have a bomb." When she unfolded the paper, the words were simple and direct. He was hijacking the plane. To prove his claim, Cooper opened his briefcase just enough for her to see inside. There were red cylindrical objects, wires, and a battery. Whether it was a real bomb would later become a matter of debate. But at that moment, the distinction didn't matter. The threat was credible enough. The flight attendant alerted the cockpit, and within minutes, Flight 305 was no longer a routine trip. It was a federal crime in progress. Once contact was established between the cockpit and air traffic control, Cooper's demands were relayed with precision. He wanted $200,000 in cash, for parachutes, and a fuel truck waiting on the tarmac in Seattle. There were no ultimatums, no countdown clocks, no violence. Cooper did not shout or threaten passengers. He did not move erratically or attempt to control the cabin. Instead, he remained seated, sipping his drink, while the machinery of federal law enforcement sprang into action around him. The FBI was notified immediately. This was not treated as a regional crime. It was a national security incident. Authorities in Seattle agreed to meet his demands. As the plane circled Puget Sound, officials debated their options. Could they overpower him? Could the bomb be fake? Should they risk the passengers' lives? In the end, they chose compliance. When Flight 305 landed in Seattle, Cooper instructed the crew to remain calm. The ransom money was delivered in a knapsack. The parachutes were brought aboard. Only then did Cooper allow the passengers to leave the aircraft. Every single one walked off safely. No one was harmed. No one was traumatized. It was an almost surgical hijacking, efficient, controlled, and eerily polite. And then Cooper made his final request. Cooper ordered the plane to take off again. This time, the destination was Mexico City, but the conditions he set were unusual. He demanded the aircraft fly at low altitude, no higher than 10,000 feet, at a slow speed, with the rear air stair deployed. This detail stunned aviation experts. At the time, only one commercial aircraft model, the Boeing 727, was capable of safely flying with its rear stairs open. Cooper knew this. He wasn't improvising. He had studied the plane. He understood its mechanics. He knew what it could do. This immediately changed the FBI's assessment of the hijacker. This was not a desperate man acting on impulse. This was someone with technical knowledge, possibly a pilot, an engineer, or a military veteran. As the plane climbed into the night sky, storm clouds rolled in. Rain battered the fuselage. Wind shook the aircraft. Somewhere between Seattle and Reno, Nevada, Cooper stood up. He secured the money. He strapped on a parachute. He adjusted his tie, and then, without warning, he disappeared into the darkness. No one saw him jump. The crew felt only a sudden change in air pressure and a slight movement of the aircraft. When the plane landed in Reno hours later, the truth became clear. Dan Cooper was gone. So was the money. There was nobody there, an parachute, an confirmed landing site. Just empty sky and endless wilderness below. The FBI immediately launched one of the most extensive manhunts in its history. The investigation was codenamed NORJAC, Northwest Hijacking. Agents combed forests, rivers, and mountain ranges. The military assisted with aerial searches. Civilian volunteers joined ground operations. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Nothing was found. No remains, no equipment, no trace of Cooper. Public confidence began to shift. Had he survived? Or had the wilderness quietly claimed him? The FBI assured the public that survival was impossible. But history would soon complicate that certainty. By the morning after the hijacking, the Pacific Northwest had become the center of one of the largest coordinated search operations in American history. The FBI, local law enforcement, and the U.S. military all converged on a rough search zone stretching across parts of Washington and Oregon. Based on flight speed, altitude, wind direction, and timing, investigators attempted to calculate where Cooper might have landed. The problem was that every variable worked against them. It was night, there was heavy rain, winds were unpredictable, visibility was poor, and the terrain below was among the most unforgiving in the country. Dense forests, steep ravines, rivers swollen by seasonal rainfall, and miles of uninhabited wilderness. Search teams moved on foot through thick undergrowth. Helicopters scanned from above. Planes flew grid patterns over vast areas of land. They found nothing. No parachute tangled in trees, no torn fabric, no footprints, no human remains. Days passed, then weeks. As time stretched on, the FBI began to publicly suggest that Cooper had not survived the jump. The narrative hardened quickly. No one could jump into that environment at night in a suit and loafers and live. It was a comforting explanation, but it was also an assumption. Behind the scenes, not everyone agreed with the official position. Some aviation experts pointed out that Cooper had demanded multiple parachutes, suggesting he understood descent options. Others noted that experienced parachutists had survived worse conditions. But the investigation was already moving in a specific direction. If Cooper died in the jump, then there was no fugitive to catch. That assumption shaped everything that followed. Searches gradually slowed. Resources were reallocated. The sense of urgency faded. This wasn't negligence. It was institutional momentum. Once an agency commits to a theory, especially one that resolves uncertainty, it becomes difficult to reverse course. But then something happened that threatened the entire narrative. Nearly 9 years after the hijacking, in February 1980, a young boy was digging along the banks of the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. He wasn't searching for evidence. He was playing. What he uncovered shocked everyone. Buried in the sand were bundles of decaying cash. When the serial numbers were checked, there was no doubt. This was Cooper's ransom money. The discovery created immediate problems for the FBI. If Cooper died in the jump, how did the money get there? The river location was not within the original search zone. The bills were partially decomposed, but still bundled with rubber bands, suggesting they had not simply washed downstream randomly. The Bureau now faced questions it couldn't easily answer. Had Cooper survived and hidden part of the money? Has someone else found it and reburied it? Had the original jump location been wrong all along? The money contradicted years of assumptions. And instead of reopening the case aggressively, the FBI became more cautious. With renewed public interest came a surge of tips. Over the decades, more than 800 individuals were investigated as potential suspects. Some were suggested by family members. Others were identified by amateur sleuths. A few were actively pursued by federal agents. There were veterans with parachuting experience, pilots familiar with the Boeing 727, men who disappeared suddenly in the early 1970s. Each suspect followed a familiar pattern. At first, the details seemed to fit. Then something didn't. Alibis emerged. Physical descriptions didn't align. Timelines collapsed. In some cases, promising leads were abandoned because early evidence had not been preserved properly. In others, critical documents were missing entirely. The investigation had grown too old for modern forensic science and too fragmented for reconstruction. By the time DNA analysis became a powerful investigative tool, much of the original evidence from the Cooper case was compromised. Items handled by dozens of people, stored without modern protocols, exposed to environmental degradation. Fragments of DNA were recovered from the tie Cooper left behind, but the samples were incomplete. There was no reliable match. This became a recurring theme in the case. Answers arriving decades after the opportunity to use them had passed. The system had evolved, but the evidence had not. As years turned into decades, the Cooper case became something of an internal burden. Younger agents were assigned to it without institutional memory. Retired investigators disagreed publicly about conclusions. Some believed Cooper survived and lived quietly under a new identity. Others insisted he never made it to the ground alive. But no one could prove either side. Inside the FBI, the case became symbolic, not of failure, but of limits. Limits of technology, limits of early investigative standards, limits of certainty. In July 2016, without warning, the FBI announced it was closing the active investigation. There was no dramatic explanation, just a short statement. The FBI is redirecting resources toward cases with a higher likelihood of resolution. That was it. No mention of mistakes. No acknowledgement of unresolved questions in a final theory. For a case that had reshaped aviation security and captivated the public for generations, the ending was remarkably quiet. Retired agents later revealed what the statement did not. The case had become unsolvable not because of a lack of effort, but because of early assumptions that could not be undone. Search zones based on incomplete data, evidence handled without future science in mind, public narratives that narrowed investigative focus too early. This wasn't about incompetence. It was about systems built for a different era. Though Cooper was never identified, his impact was immediate and permanent. Airline security was transformed. Metal detectors became standard. Passenger screening was introduced. Cockpit access was restricted. Hijacking laws were rewritten. And trying to escape Cooper had exposed vulnerabilities no one wanted to admit existed. The Cooper case endures not because of mystery alone, but because it forces uncomfortable questions. What happens when institutions commit too early to a conclusion? How many cases are quietly abandoned rather than solved? And how often does certainty become the enemy of truth?